Why should anyone care about the Cold War? Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, as you well know, you are just about to launch a series, a podcast series about the Cold War. And I thought we'd devote today's episode of Bill Whittle Now to just kind of a brief overview of this series and essentially why somebody would want to listen to it. What value is there in it for people who are both students of history and not students of history, and just kind of some of your insights into this rather in-depth project that you've engaged upon. Can I start off with this question? Number one is, why should anybody in this day and age, in the year 2020, care about something that was called Cold War?
Well, because it was a war. And not only a war, it was a war that took 42 years of the country's history, at least by the markers I put down. And I think they're pretty reasonable. I start with the blockade of Berlin in 1948, and we end with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. The entire conflict determined the course of all of the second half of this 20th century, and certainly sets up where we are today. And because there was no thermonuclear exchanges during this war, it was a number of wars that I think only really make sense if contained within the larger context of the Cold War. Korea is one of them, Vietnam is another. And the magnitude of the struggle is belied by the fact that there was that in the end. Well, I think about the only conclusion you can reach, Scott, really, and I know most people find this contentious, but I think the only conclusion that you can reach, really, is that after World War II, the idea of full-scale civilizational war all out, the way that Russia and Germany face each other, for example, or we face with the Empire of Japan at the end of the Second World War, a full-scale assault on that level would be suicide. And not just I don't know about the entire world, but certainly it's suicide for the two countries involved. And so you have, for the first time ever in human history, this titanic conflict where you are limited from going all the way to war by the fact that going all the way to war means that it's game over. There are no winners in that situation. There were 25,000 nuclear warheads on each side at the peak of the Cold War.
Bill, could we almost say that this was essentially a nearly 5-decade way of doing peace?
No, I don't think it's tempting to look at it that way. Again, because the worst case scenario never developed, and even the mid case scenario, like a conventional war in Europe, never developed, because a conventional war in Europe was going to lead to a full-on strategic nuclear war, because, as somebody pointed out, and I didn't know this until very much later in life, but for most of the 80s anyway, late 70s and 80s, there were entire scenarios made up where the Russians would invade the West through the Fulda Gap, which is a terrain feature in Germany. And then the entire war would be essentially a conventional war with massive numbers of Soviet armor and troops coming into the West through the Fulda Gap. And then the U.S. would have to supply Europe with transatlantic convoys. The Soviets would try to interdict them and so on with bombers and long-range standoff missiles. And that's how they were always gamed out. But the reason that I think it didn't happen is because, consciously or not, I think everybody realized that there was no way to contain this. And the way I heard that was best describes this was, nobody will agree to lose a war and surrender while they still have weapons that are capable of winning it. I think that is a profound analysis of why the idea of a war in Europe that could have been either completely conventional or contained a tactical battlefield nuclear weapons wasn't really going to last. And the thing about, here's what I did, Scott. I mean, we've got 4 decades worth of stuff. And when I originally had the idea, and I outlined it into 10 episodes, and that wasn't enough, so I had to go to 12. I had all the milestones in the Cold War, all the things I wanted to cover, and I wanted to go to different places down the line. I certainly didn't want to do 1965 to 1970, that kind of thing. But what I found was, as I was writing it, that I can't describe it, just masses of data just started flowing past. There's just so much stuff going on. And what I ended up doing, I think, was I ended up serving as kind of a filter for that data. And all of this historical current is coming by. And basically, I'm standing on the side of this enormous river and saying, that's interesting. That's cool. And that connects to that, which is also cool. And so what this particular series that I'm just wrapping up now did was it took a look at the Cold War chronologically, but rather than an evenly paced kind of this happened and that happened, I tried to find those moments that captured the essence of either that moment or of the position in the world that both countries were in.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is really when people who are not accustomed to studying vast stretches of history, it's like saying the 100 Years' War or a war that even lasts for 7 years. Most people, when they think of history, think of, okay, well, there are certain dates you have to remember and key events that happened and key characters during that time. Will somebody listening to this series that you are doing on the Cold War be able to say, oh, those were the heroes and those were the villains, and this is where the hero was trying to get?
Yes. I'm certainly not agnostic in terms of either the victors in the Cold War or of the relative positions of the two combatants. And of all the things that I tried to do in this series, I have a Russian wife, and I always had tried to be fair to the Russians anyway, but needless to say, I'm even more aware of that now. And I have some many insights from her that I hadn't really been aware of before, coming from the Russian side of the argument. But there's no question that one of the great travesties of talking about this period of history is to talk about the Cold War as basically a disagreement between equal ideologies. A lot of people want to make the Cold War kind of like Coke versus Pepsi. There's our system and their system, and they're more or less the same. And we had different strategic objectives. And some people who don't know anything about it will start talking about oil and all the rest of it. But you simply can't compare the two. One of the points I make fairly early in the war, and it's just a minor point, but it does give you some idea. Joseph Stalin had murdered 10, 15 million of his own people in the Ukraine during the 20s and 30s, starved them to death, and executions were continuing in the Lubyanka, which is still in downtown Moscow, for decades. Probably 800,000 people were killed in an office building next to a toy store over the course of the run of the Soviet Union. So Joseph Stalin on one day signed 3,600 death warrants. That's on one day. And on one day, Dwight Eisenhower got so angry that he kind of threw a golf club in the general direction of one of his aides. Now, if you think that these two things are equal, you have a serious cognitive problem. To say that the worst thing that the Soviet premier did was to murder 3,600 people in a day, millions and millions and millions of them over time, versus the U.S. president, whose worst crime essentially was he had a temper and threw a golf club and didn't hit anybody with it, then that is an indication. It may seem like a frivolous indication, but it's not. This is the difference between the two systems. And all of the Cold War is predicated on understanding the difference between these two ideologies. And the two ideologies, I'm very clear on this, I hope. Let's just get all of the other window dressing and publicity terms out of there, okay? Wasn't godless communism, forget about all of that, or rapacious cap. No. The Cold War was a monumental conflict between two ideas, and they were the ideas of a society based on individuals or a society based on the state. And when you have a society based on the state, everything that you do as strategy is going to be affected by the fact that you view people as the masses. They're interchangeable. And I think one of the best examples of this, I go into this in some detail. The first nuclear submarine was USS Nautilus. And it is perfectly preserved today up in Groton, Connecticut. The first Soviet submarine was K-19. The Nautilus had an absolutely faultless career, and if you look at Nautilus today in 2020, she looks like she's just ready to start her career, like she just rolled off the ways, and she looks brand new. K-19's rusted out hulk. But K-19 killed 10 Russians before she even went to sea. K-19 had reactors that had leaks. The ship was sinking. They had to send engineers into the compartment. 10 guys were killed within the first 2 weeks from radiation exposure. They cleaned her out, dumped the core into the ocean, put a new core in, contaminated an area at their own dock about a mile wide, sent another crew out there. The boat caught fire again and so on. And probably 50 or 60 Russian sailors died on K-19 without ever having fired a shot in anger.
Yeah, Bill, I think one of the challenges of the Cold War for people to get their heads around is it's, in contrast, let's say, to World War II. When I think of World War II, I think of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. I think of Adolf Hitler and Charles de Gaulle. I think of Hirohito. I think of, Ike and Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. There are particular human faces that you can put on this conflict. Can that happen too with the Cold War? You've mentioned Ike as well as Stalin. Are those the kind of personages into which you can embody these principles, or is it just ideas on almost a platonic level?
They're not ideas in any way, shape, or form. The magnitude of the personalities of the president and the Soviet premier are what determined the Cold War at any stage during the Cold War. And you bring up a really excellent point, because if you look at World War II, you had Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin against Hitler and Mussolini and, to some lesser degree, Tojo or someone in Japan. And they were the same parties throughout the 4 or 5 year conflict. In the Cold War, from memory now, the Cold War went through 11 U.S. presidencies and I want to say 6 or 7 Soviet premiers. And every single time one of the sides would change, once Eisenhower would be replaced by Kennedy, that would completely change the dynamic. Once Khrushchev moved in and took over power from Malenkov, then Khrushchev changed the dynamic. And so what you get is you get a timeline that's just constantly doing this as each one of the two sides is changing, and then each side has to deal with the two personalities. Because the thing of it is, Scott, a lot of people say the Cold War was fought by proxy, and that's true. Vietnam was a proxy war against the Soviets, and so was Korea, and so was Afghanistan. But what it really was a full-scale civilizational clash that ultimately came down to the world's largest, most expensive, and most influential ad campaign in history. That's really what the Cold War was.
An ad campaign for what?
For your idea, for your ideology. Since you couldn't fight, you had to, and since the entire, we talk about the third world today, and most people don't know what the term means. They think the third world is just a place where, there's a lot of poverty, and that's true. But the term third world came from the fact that right after World War II, there was the democratic capitalist West, led mostly by the United States, but Britain, France, West Germany, and all the rest. And then there was the communist bloc East, which was Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, China. And during a 42-year period, these two ideologies were struggling to win the hearts and minds and the territory and bases and resources of the rest of the planet. And since they couldn't actually start slugging it out, they had to use, essentially, publicity. And
so would you say
the space race is a great example of that.
Presidents in both cases, the leaders in the Soviet Union and the presidents in the United States, were the celebrity spokespeople for this ideology?
Yes, and I don't mean to say it was just that. The Soviet policy from the beginning, look, I don't think there's much historical question about this, and I'm certainly open to debate it, and we'll be talking about that too, obviously, when we get into the comments on this podcast and so on. But the Cold War began when the Soviet Union reneged on virtually all of the agreements they made at the Potsdam Conference at the end of World War II. And Joseph Stalin found himself in control of all of Europe. He had millions and millions of men and thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and he was simply waiting for the dust to settle so that he could take over all of Europe, possible exception of Great Britain.
And in contrast, the United States had basically taken everybody back home.
And deconstructed their entire military. There'd never been demobilization like that in history. But just before the end of the war, just as Stalin is looking at his board and saying, this is fantastic, we'll have a couple years of peace, then we'll just move forward from where the Iron Curtain was and we'll just take the rest of Europe. Just before the end of the war, the second episode in the series is called Two Bombs. And the Nagasaki bomb and the Hiroshima bomb were needed to end the war with Japan. That's beyond discussion. The war ended because of those bombs. But all of a sudden, Stalin's calculation is completely upset. He has a chessboard where he has unbelievable resources, conventional resources. He's a dictator. He's got huge, endless supplies of manpower. And if he kills a few more million people at the end of World War II, as we know it, well, it's a small price to pay to have the socialist domination of all of Europe. All of a sudden, the Americans with these two toys have utterly changed that dynamic. Stalin could say, well, we'll take a little bit of bombing. No, you're not going to take bombing. Now you're going to take the loss of everything. Your city's going to go. The Kremlin's going to go. All of these massed units you have in the field, they're just going to disappear, flash a light. And that realization altered the expansionist qualities of the Soviet Union and forced them into a number of aggressive actions. People talk about American imperialism, but the Korean War was started when North Korean communists invaded the South. Vietnam was started when North Vietnamese communists invaded the South. The communists invaded Hungary. They invaded Czechoslovakia. They invaded Poland. They maintained their empire with an iron boot. And so much of what we talk about in this, my entire purpose, Scott, was to make this series a sequential episode of human events, things that people could connect to. There was a time in the Berlin crisis of 1961 where American and Soviet tanks were about 200 yards away from each other, barrel to barrel on either side of Checkpoint Charlie. And there were negotiations to try and de-escalate this. And they did de-escalate it. And the way they de-escalated it was they made some concessions to the Soviets. This is what I mean by a PR campaign. And all of these concessions were made for one reason, and that was so that the first tank to move back would be a Soviet tank. And this is not an exaggeration. So on this particular day, a Soviet tank backs up 10 yards and an American tank backs up 10 yards. And then another Soviet tank, and then another American tank. And this goes on for hours until finally they're not staring down each other's barrels anymore. But so much was placed on who's going to move first, because that's how you won a battle of publicity and PR. You had to go for these symbolic victories. The entire space race was the most focused part of the Cold War, because the space race was all of the Cold War in miniature. And the space race featured all of the weaponry of the Cold War. All of those boosters were intercontinental ballistic missiles and radars, tracking stations, Navy recovery, all of this stuff.
And yet we are ungrateful to Joseph Stalin.
Well, Joseph Stalin, if not the worst man in history, he's certainly on the podium.
Let me ask you, what was, and perhaps you can clarify something and then answer this question.
Sure.
First of all, I know that some people are going to be seeing this series who are unfamiliar, or hearing this series rather, who are unfamiliar with your previous work. So the quick question is this a partisan series in the sense of Republican or Democrat? And then the follow-up question is, what's the most interesting or startling thing that you discovered, or something that may have changed your opinion in the course of your research?
It is not partisan. There are things that Republicans did during the Cold War that I approved of and disapproved of, and likewise for Democrats. It's not about domestic politics, with the possible exception of the aftermath of Vietnam. But other than that, it is basically America versus the Soviets. I deal more with Soviet internal politics, especially in the beginning, than I do with American politics, because it's much more interesting. Those people are literally murdering each other. And as far as the lessons go, looking back on it, the level of fear was so profound that it actually, in retrospect, seems really strange. We would, when Johnson fought the first half of the Vietnam War, there was a 30-mile exclusion zone around Hanoi, around Haiphong. You could not engage enemy jets unless you could visually identify them and they showed hostile intent, as if they're shooting at you. You couldn't shoot at a SAM site unless it shot first. You couldn't attack enemy airfields. All of this was to make sure that no Soviet advisors got killed. As if a Soviet advisor getting killed in Vietnam while he's unloading SAM missiles from a Soviet ship in Hanoi is going to start the full-scale nuclear war. That kind of level of fear, I think, was strangely overblown. But of all the things that I have from the takeaway here, there were two incidents where the world was one person's decision away from coming to an end. One of them happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of them happened in the 1980s. Both cases, the decision not to destroy the world was made by Russians. And the reason, I remember distinctly this thought process, in both cases, separated by about 23, 24 years, a Russian officer was under standing orders to launch nuclear missiles. And in both cases, individual people refused. And you have to understand that this is the Soviet Union, where for just saying something funny about somebody, you would be either executed or disappear, and your family would go with you. The moral courage it took for that actually put me in a position where I was a bit jealous. Like, how come there were no Americans doing this, kind of stepping in as being the circuit breaker? And in retrospect, the reason is because the systems were so different that the Soviet system was predicated on, if A happens, then B will happen. There is no discussion about it. If you see these warning tracks on this radar, you will launch the missiles. There was no consideration at all. In fact, on the contrary, what they were trying to do was trying to get individual decisions out of it. The Soviets had set up a series of almost like ironclad rules where if this happens, you will do this. The American system never produced anything like that. And in two cases of astonishing moral courage, two cases where Soviet officers were, in fact, directly ordered to push the button, and they simply said no. That leads me to the final conclusion, which I haven't written yet, but is been hanging over the whole series. And that is simply this. Was the nuclear Armageddon that we all grew up under, and that constant, look, I didn't think we were going to get out of the 1980s. For most of my life, I didn't think I was going to live to see 30. I really didn't, honestly, and most of us didn't. But looking back on it, I wonder if it was even possible. I suspect on some level, just as a topic of discussion, that in the end, it was so horrible, so unthinkable, that pushing the button would have been beyond the ability of when I say pushing the button, I mean things like a bomber crew actually releasing thermonuclear weapon over Moscow and so on. I'm not saying they wouldn't have done it, but on some level, it seems that this fundamental human instinct for survival, even survival in the face of defeat and enemy victory, kept being a circuit breaker between us and the abyss.
Bill, final question.
Sure.
It occurs to me that conducting such a long, continuous, expensive campaign requires a certain level of unified purpose and a national cohesion on the part of the United States. It's a little different for the Soviet Union, well, a lot different for the Soviet Union because they essentially mandate that national cohesion. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, it takes a free will offering of national unity. And I wonder if you think today this country has that kind of ability to pull together, despite all of our differences and the divisions and the political entanglements in which we're engaged right now. If faced with a similar challenge, could we come together well enough to conduct a multi-decadal, multi-generational battle for the hearts and minds of the world?
Yes and no, and I don't mean to be opaque here. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. I cannot envision a situation where the United States would be facing that kind of threat again in the foreseeable future. And so when I say no, I only say no because I cannot imagine a calculation that would put the American people into that situation. But when I say yes, and I don't mean this to sound flip at all, but if a series of alien motherships were to invade the Earth and we were faced with an existential struggle for survival, I haven't got the slightest doubt whatsoever that we would respond in the same way. I think the problem with American society now is the problem that has, and this is ultimately my final goal on this, is that if you look at the cycle of civilizations all the way through history, not just the Cold War, you find that when a society finally becomes dominant, the way that the Greek city-states did, or the Romans did, or the British Empire, or whatever, you would think that once one of these these empires gets so far above its competition that it is now essentially all alone. It's the only player on the field. You would think that without the competition, that would say, boom, off it goes. It just, and we'd still be speaking Latin and dressing with funny skirts if that were the case. But what actually happens is when a society reaches that point where they become essentially unchallengeable economically, technologically, culturally, and so on, just the opposite happens. They simply just stop and fall off the cliff. And it turns out that I think any real analysis of the long cycles of human history show, and this is the tragedy of the human condition, honestly, in a nutshell. They show that once you've achieved enough prosperity and security, you start to take it for granted, and then the society that you built that was so strong and so healthy and vibrant and growing begins to rot from the inside. And this has just happened so many times in history, you really almost can't count it. We're certainly in that same edge of the cycle here in our American civilization. But as I like to say, and as I genuinely do believe, because of things like this program, and I'm not saying this program specifically, although I'm sure when history is written, Bill Whittle now will in fact be the one thing that did in fact save human civilization. But when you really get down to it, this is the first time in all of these cycles of history, all of them, they've always come down to the elites become bored, they become enamored with other civilizations, they become very despising of their own self, and they're constantly trying to tell themselves how much better they are than their own people. And this has led to the collapse of all of these societies. This is the first time in history ever that regular people have been able to talk to each other directly without having to be filtered through the priesthood or the aristocracy of the news media and the priesthood of the news media. For the first time in human history, the regular people who have always been ready to defend the civilization that they lived in, always ready to put down their plows and go to the walls and defend their city, for the first time ever, they're able to talk to each other and encourage each other. And this may be the one way out of the cycle of history where somebody in the palace wearing silk robes gets up at midnight and opens the gates to the barbarian, because even though he's going to be killed doing it, at least it might be somewhat amusing.
Well, Bill, I'm sure that if somebody's still watching this program at this point, they'd like to know, what's the name of this series? Where can we find it? Who made it? And when does it start?
It's the second in a series that I've been doing for Esoteric Radio Theatre, which is a kind of a new organization designed to do these kind of somewhat off-politics events. The first one I did was Apollo 11, What We Saw, which was an enormous honor for me and tremendous fun.
And you can search for that on BillWhittle.com. You'll see we have one post that has all 4 episodes of it on one post. It
is without doubt the best work I've ever done, and because I love it so much. The same thing for the Cold War. It's just I just am so fascinated by it, and I understand it pretty well. So this one's going to be called The Cold War, What We Saw. It's going to be a series of podcasts. We'll have a link for every one of them as they become available. So the first one was released over the weekend, and we put a link up for that. It was just an interview with Peter Robinson, who wrote the Mr. Gorbachev Tear Down This Wall speech for Ronald Reagan. I did an hour-and-a-half interview with him talking inside baseball about the Cold War, especially and most importantly, and this is the focus of my entire series, on the moral aspect of the Cold War, the moral equation. And then they played 5 minutes of the first episode as a tease, and then starting on Friday, the first of the actual episodes will appear, and there'll be one every week for 12 weeks. And the amount of post-production work they've done on it, they've brought in audio recordings, they've cut their own music score for it. It's not just me sitting there yapping. It is a beautifully produced series. And the Apollo 11 series was in the top 3 worldwide on Apple Podcasts. Each one of the 4 episodes was. And I don't know if we'll be able to recreate that kind of success, but certainly it is a ambitious project. It is exclusively about the stories that are worth telling. That's the point I was making about the filter. What in the middle of all of this data, in 1792, 14, what individual story is worth telling in detail to give you an idea of what was actually going on? And I'm not going to run this out, but just as one small example of what I'm talking about, the Cold War was 40 years of espionage. And I spent a great deal of time on Project Azorian, which was the CIA's effort to reach down 16,000 feet to the bottom of the ocean, grab a Soviet submarine that had sunk due to malfunction, and lift it up into the middle of a hollow boat and sail the whole thing back to America. Just reach out in the deepest part of the Pacific, go down 16,000 feet with the claw, grab the submarine, bring it back, go back to the United States, do it in front of the eyes of the world, and not have anybody know about it. That particular incident was one of many incidents in the Cold War in terms of intelligence gathering, but that one in detail shows you the ingenuity, the depth, the expense, the setbacks, the challenges, and it's just such a shockingly unbelievable true story that I think it's just riveting. It was riveting reading about it and writing it, and hopefully those kind of examples will bring a human texture to this enormous conflict that affects all of our lives and will affect the rest of our lives for the rest of our lives.
We will provide prominent links to Bill's Cold War podcast series at BillWhittle.com. BillWhittle.com, of course, made possible by the members who fund it on a monthly and annual basis, who believe that historical context is important in evaluating current events, and who believe that there are some bedrock, time-tested principles that endure throughout time and help you to analyze what's happening today and to create a more happy society. If you're one of those,
the good guys won that war.
What's that?
I said the good guys won that war.
If you are this kind of a person and you're not yet a member at BillWhittle.com, go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. If you'd like to join some of those people in a casual atmosphere of relaxation and fun and, frankly, reinvigoration before the big 2020 final campaign push for the presidential election, join us May 15th through the 18th on a 3-night Bahamian cruise coming out of the port of Miami, stopping for a day at a private island, and just enjoying all the luxury of a Royal Caribbean cruise with people that you're just going to love, and also me and Bill and Stephen Green, as well as our lovely spouses. You can find out more by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking on the big picture of the boat. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.